My name is David Borrow. I'm Deputy Leader and Finance Portfolio Holder at Lancashire. I'm one of the Vice Chairs of CCN and the spokesperson for Finance, and I've been asked to chair this session on finance. And I suppose we all look at the finance for county councils with a mixture of fear and hope, given the 4-year settlement and the 100% retention of business rates and the resetting of the formula for needs. And I think those are some of the issues that we're going to look at. I think from a Lancashire perspective, we were one of the handful of councils that didn't sign up for the 4-year deals. And probably the main reason for that, we recently had a report done by PricewaterhouseCoopers into our finances, which indicated that on the basis of the cuts we've already implemented or agreed, we've still got a budget gap in 2020 of £148 million. 90 million of that is adult social care. And the key thing that the PricewaterhouseCoopers report indicated that if we reduced our spending in each service area to those of the lowest spending councils in each service area, we would still have a budget gap of £80 million. Our reserves are due to run out during 2018-19, so it's not surprising that we declined to sign up to a 4-year deal that is clearly not sustainable. But we did get a reply from the Minister. It will be interesting to see his reaction later on this afternoon, which asked us to come forward with some ideas for further savings, and if we did so, he might be willing to speak to us. So I think we're on our own on that. This afternoon's session is split into 2 parts. We've got a team from Leicestershire, led by Byron Rhodes, the Deputy Leader of Leicestershire County Council, with Chris Tambini, Chief Finance Officer, and Joe Miller, who is going to assist in that. And at the end, we've got Pete Moore from Lincolnshire, who is President of the Society of County Treasurers. So these 2 presentations should fit together nicely and lead to a discussion. I understand, I wasn't here this morning because we got delayed from Lancashire because trains were cancelled last night, but I understand this question and the app on your phones is now working, so we will see at the end of the session when a question will mysteriously appear on that screen and answers will be revealed, and we'll see how successful that part is at the end of this session. So I think, Byron, you're going to kick off this session.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've got a good reply, it's good. Right, for the past 6 or 7 years, local government's been going through a massive retrenchment. Funding reducing every year, every council's had to reduce spending and adjust its offer to the public and businesses in its area. We're now at a point where the magnitude of the spending reductions are so great that further reductions in the pipeline are giving cause for real concern, as we just heard from the Deputy Leader of Lancashire. Some councils are running out of money or will in the not too distant future. Now, government's a perfect right to ask us to take our share of the fiscal consolidation. But because funding is not distributed fairly across local government, some councils are poorly funded compared with others. And the problem is because local government finance is so complicated, it's been very difficult to prove it. In fact, it's a mixture of smoke and mirrors, you might say. So our presentation today is aimed to blow away some of the smoke and smash the mirrors and show what's been covering this up for too long. We will show how the county councils are the poorest funded councils, in spite of having to deliver, in many cases, more vital services to more people than many unitaries. We've evaluated the funding position for every upper-tier council in England. And in order to have a very valid comparison base, we've added the district council funding to the county fundings in the 2-tier areas. So we're comparing like with like. We don't make any assumptions, by the way, that those two-tier councils are likely to go unitary or otherwise result of doing this. That's purely for the point of view of the calculations. Comparisons are therefore drawn between all the unitaries and all the counties, including the districts, on a level playing field. All the data we've used is taken from government websites. Our presentation falls into three parts. Firstly, there's an analysis showing the current position. We established a database which enabled us to look at over 100 parameters to see if there's any correlation between the funding you would expect to deliver an acceptable level of service compared with what is actually available. What we've found is a wholly inconsistent picture, almost random. In the second part of the presentation, we propose a new needs-based model. It's based on the key cost drivers, and we'll explain how this model works. And finally, we'll show what the funding position would look like for every council if the model were to be adopted in that form. Now, for some time now, we've been working with some other councils to develop this, including Lincolnshire, Staffordshire, Worcestershire, and the East Riding of Yorkshire. And their finance teams have had a look at what we've been doing, and they've made some very helpful and useful suggestions to which we've responded. We've also had the calculations examined and verified by KPMG. And also with the help of two of our local MPs, Alberto Costa and Edward Arger, we secured a meeting in September with Marcus Jones, the Minister for Local Government. And he listened with interest to our submission and followed it up by sending some of his civil servants up to Leicestershire to look at the model in detail. We believe that DCLG are now thinking broadly on the same lines as our team, and we've established an ongoing dialogue with them to further develop the model. So today we're sharing our ideas with you in the hope that we should gain your approval and support and cooperation to develop this model further. We'd like to establish it as the basis of the new way forward for assessing need in the allocation of local government funding, achieving for the first time a fair funding system based on need. Now, our presentation does not go into the process of how local government funding should be actually shared out. That's the processes. But it's our view that the emerging business rates retention model, which is already the subject of much debate, should be considered as part of a new needs-based system for local government and not as something completely separate. Indeed, if business rates retention is implemented separately, there is a significant danger that top slicing could prevent a needs-based formula from being implemented. So what we want to see in due course is a system which updates needs and funding annually. This will bring about minimum adjustments once the system has been reset and respond to trends both in needs and funding levels. So at this point now, I hand over to my team, Chris Tambini, who's Leicestershire's Finance Director, and to Joe Miller, our Head of Statistical Services, and they'll take you through the presentation. Thank you.
So there's two parts to what Joe and I are going to talk about. The first one is a bit about the current system and the current distribution of funding that that throws up, and then a bit about a potential new model, which we'll take through in a bit of detail. I'm not going to go through this slide. I think everybody's familiar with some of the shortcomings of the current system. The one bullet that's not really on there is the impact that aggression plays in terms of funding. So your current funding level is usually based on the funding level was 1, 2, 3 years ago, and it's probably about time we kind of started to break out of that cycle where everything's based on historical trends. In terms of the current system, what we've modelled is core spending power. And core spending power is just another way of saying income. So the key elements of core spending power are revenue support grant, council tax and business rates. So we modelled that. There's some other elements such as new homes bonus and some of the I've flipped into another thing. Right. There's some other elements such as rural services grant and transitional grant, but the key elements are those three. So by core spending power, you just need to remember that is income. If you click into the analysis, one of the reasons we used core spending power is because that's the way the government presents information to us. And we were looking at grant, we were looking at other elements, but when you're presenting the information back to government, we thought it's best using the information they provide to us. I do understand that there are some shortcomings and some criticisms of it, but actually it kind of, there are some plus points to it, and it does help demonstrate the case. This is quite a complicated slide. So if you but I'll try and simplify it. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, so that's core spending power per head of population. And what we've done, as Byron said, is we've looked at all 150 upper tier areas. So we've added in districts into counties, we've added in fire in, we've added into the Greater London Authority into London. So core spending power per head of population is that far left column. And the very obvious thing, I just heard somebody say it, it's all London. So inner London, basically followed by out of London, are the most highly funded local authorities in the country. If you go down very much right down to the bottom, scroll down, and you'll see, and there's a number of county areas. Leicestershire is the lowest funded per head of population of any county area, but there are a number of other counties, and the next slide up there are more counties. I think the most interesting thing for me when we did this is just looking at the authorities that are down there. So you've got the likes of Warrington, Bury, Leeds, mixed among the other counties. And it just didn't look like it made sense. You wouldn't think that they should be the lowest funded, and you wouldn't think the ones at the top should be the highest funded. So if you go back to the top again, just to show the magnitude of the differences in funding, is the middle column is the difference per head from Leicestershire as the lowest funded county. The final column is if we received the same spending power per head as Camden, how much extra money Leicestershire would get. So for Camden, it's over £400 million extra. So the Leicestershire County Council budget would more than double if we received the same spending power as some of the inner London authorities. So there's a huge difference between the high funded and the low funded. It's got a 100% difference between the top and the bottom. So we did that bit of work, thought that looks a little bit odd, but we thought, well, maybe there is a reason why that distribution of funding is apparent. And I will actually add, because we've shown this to a few people, and people didn't believe it, we did get KPMG to check it out, and they've checked out the calculation, and they've supported it. So we did an extra bit of work to see whether there was actually a correlation between that kind of level of spending power and needs. And I'll pass you on to Jo now, who'll take you through some of that analysis.
So we have another graphic here. So basically what we've done is we've looked at the core spending power per resident as of 16-17, which is the axis on the left-hand side. And then in our database, as Byron mentioned, we have got 100 indicators that we've plugged into this. So I'm just going to show an example of a couple of key indicators to see if there's any relationship between need or demand and core spending power. So if we just start off with a key one, so deprivation or income deprivation. So the ability for residents to pay for services themselves. This shows on the bottom axis the rank of income deprivation. So rank of 1 is most deprived. So over on the left-hand side are the most deprived, and on the right-hand side the least deprived. And at the top of the chart, the highest core spending power, and at the bottom the lowest. So you can see there's a spurious relationship here. You would expect to see a clear relationship going from right to left. So as deprivation increases, core spending power increases. But you've got outliers, clear outliers. Richmond upon Thames, we see, high core spending power. And if we just isolate the inner London boroughs, you can see how they really don't show a great relationship with the driver of need or demand. And if we just now drill down to county council areas only, you can see again there's not a clear relationship. So you've got an area here like Lincolnshire, the most deprived in terms of income of all the county councils, receiving below average core spending power and one of the lowest county councils on core spending power. So if I just put that back to all geographies, and we have another look at a different indicator. So if we look at the percentage of the population aged 65 or over, obviously a key driver of demand for our services, again, not a great relationship, if any, there, and it could be argued that some of the areas with the lowest proportion of their population aged over 65 receiving the highest core spending power. And again, it's that relationship there with the inner London boroughs seemingly being odd outliers in the system. If you've got somewhere like Dorset, a very high proportion of their population age over 65, but below average core spending power. And again, if we just drill down into county areas only, there's a better relationship, but it's not a clear relationship. So roughly speaking, the higher the population over 65, the higher the core spending power, but the clear outliers in that relationship. So just to say, of all these 100 indicators that we've looked at in this system, only 13 of the 100 show a statistical correlation between the indicator of need and core spending power. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint slides.
So after we did that analysis, which kind of seemed to rubbish the whole system, but Byron asked us to come up with a new system, and very rashly we said that we would try and do so. So the first thing we did is we talked to all our directors and we said, what drives your cost? So what are the key cost drivers in your service that really do drive the cost? And I'm not going to go through all these, but we grouped them under those headings. So for adult social care, we came up with a small number of cost drivers. So the first one is the numbers of older people. That clearly does drive your cost, and we've taken people over 80 because they were the ones that really did drive the cost. The second one we looked at was income deprivation, because if you're a wealthy pensioner, you pay for your social care. If you're a poor pensioner, you don't pay. So that's clearly a key element of it. And the third one we identified was number of disabled younger adults, because generally they don't have any assets, so generally a local government pays for those services. And we went through a kind of an equivalent kind of thought process with all those kind of areas and came up with what we thought were the key cost drivers, the ones that really should impact on the amount of money local authorities receive. We also know that there are other factors that do impact in terms of the amount of money local authorities need. One is area cost, one's sparsity, one's density. We've recognised those in the new model, but what we've done, because I know we've just in effect taken the DCLG existing indicators and applied them within the model, and I do accept that there's a number of criticisms about some of those, such as the sparsity one should have more weighting, but we've taken the existing sparsity indicator and the existing weighting and applied it within our model, and it still shows up some very interesting results. So in terms of how the model works, is under those kind of 5 key service headings, we know how much core spending power relates to those areas. So £16 billion nationally is spent on adult social care, and we know those for the other areas as well. We've also know the cost drivers, so we know the numbers of older people in individual areas, we know the income deprivation in individual areas, and by doing a weighted average, we can share out that 16 billion in a much more fairer way. And we can do those for all the other blocks. And then we've applied sparsity, density and area cost as a kind of multiplier to those in terms of the weighting to come up with a new distribution of funding. And I'll pass you back to Jo now. I'll take you through the results of that.
Okay, so the graphs we've got here are showing the results of that needs-based model, and basically showing a redistribution of core spending power basically from London to other county or council areas, and the biggest winner out of that being county councils. So we're looking at a redistribution really of about £1.6 billion of core spending power from London to other authority types. So if we just start by looking and drilling down at the county council level, so basically this shows the redistribution. So on the left-hand side, we've got the core spending power per head as of 16-17, so the current system, and on the right-hand side, the core spending power as per our model. So you can see there's a general upward shift and a closing of the gap between the highest and the lowest. Now, If you just look at Lincolnshire, that was one of the areas that our analysis of need and demand shows that receiving quite high levels of demand, and they have increased under the new system. If we just add on to that picture inner London boroughs, you can see how that picture is changing quite dramatically. And you've got places like Kensington and Chelsea from the top, now somewhere in the middle. So just return that. And Tower Hamlets is now the area receiving the highest core spending power, as perhaps seems a little bit more intuitive. And then if we add to that picture the outer London boroughs, again you can see how it's just closing that gap in terms of the distribution. And then for completeness, if we just add on all the other areas just to show how that picture finally ends up. So you can see that closing of the gap at the top and the bottom. And we'll just illustrate where Leicestershire is on that. So we're still, towards the bottom there, not a huge shift. As I mentioned before, Lincolnshire's the one that makes the greatest gains in terms of the county councils. But there is no new money in the system, it is a redistribution. So if we just move on now to the graph that Chris showed previously. So the first column, as before, was the core spending power per head in terms of the 16-17 figure. So London dominating the top of the chart. The second column is now the core spending power per head according to our modelled data. So if we just reorder that column, you can see that the top of the table changes quite significantly. You've now got places like Tower Hamlets at the top, so there are still some London boroughs there, but it's not dominated. You've got Lincolnshire as being the highest county council, but you have got other authority types featuring at the top, so Blackpool, Hartlepool, Torbay as examples, Norfolk and other county council there. If we look at the third, or just stick on that second column, if we look towards the bottom now, Leicestershire is still towards the bottom, but it's by nowhere near the bottom of the chart. So you've got places like Richmond upon Thames receiving the least. Let's go back up to the top, and the third column is the change per head in terms of core spending power from the existing to the modelled. And you can see that some of the biggest winners there in terms of change per head are, again, county councils, with Lincolnshire getting another £193 per head. If we scroll back down to the bottom, you can see where the significant changes there are in the London boroughs. And then finally, if we go to the last column and we just order on the last column, this shows what that translates into actual total core spending power change. So somewhere like Lincolnshire will get another 141 million. Staffordshire, 90 million. Hampshire, 81. So you can see there's quite significant gains. So if I just go back to the graphic that we looked at earlier, so this was the scatter plots of core spending power by need. If we go back to the first one we looked at, which was income deprivation. So this is the current picture for 16-17. And if we just change how that looks now for our modelled data, you can see there's a much tighter relationship now between the driver or the indicator of need and core spending power. So if we just go back to the original, and again, just drill down to the county level. So this was the original core spending power 16-17 and the model data. So there's a better relationship. It's never going to be perfect because there are a number of indicators that are driving this model, so you wouldn't expect to see a perfect correlation. And if we just go back to all areas and the current data, and we look at the other indicator we looked at, so the proportion of the population aged 65 and over, so this is the current model, and this is our new model. But you can still see here that inner London boroughs are still outliers, so this may be the effect of the area cost adjustment. And again, if we just drill down into the county levels only, so this is the current core spending power, and then the modelled, there is a better fit than we saw previously. So in terms of the new model data, whereas previously we saw 13 of the 100 data sets showing a correlation, in the new modelled system, 49 show statistical correlation between core spending power and need. So if we can go back to the slides, please.
I'm not going to dwell on council tax, but just to say that there are implications for council tax within the model. And I think everybody's familiar with the fact that most of the lower levels of council tax are within London. I think Kent have done a lot of really good work on this. But if you're going to shift resources around, there will be an impact on council tax, which I accept is politically very difficult. But I think it'll be a necessity if you're going to actually change the funding position. I'll just end by talking very briefly about kind of other funding. So if you could click back into the model again. We've done this for a number of different, we've done it for specific grants, we've done it for other bits and pieces. What this is car parking income per head. and it's a very similar pattern. So you've got London boroughs getting considerably more car parking income per head than county areas. These figures aren't insubstantial. We've worked out that if Leicestershire had the same car parking income per head as the average in a London borough, we would get £60 million more money. So these figures are considerable. And we've done analysis around specific grants as well. So I think on all levels, the current system doesn't look particularly fair. I'm going to end there, and I'm going to pass you over to Pete Moore, the current president of the SET.
Okay, I'm going to skip through some of the detail on these slides because time is tight. I want to leave sort of a little bit of time at the end for one or two questions. I was going to say, I keep saying to my leader we should start investing in car parks or buy a few sort of spaces to generate a bit of car parking income. And it is a serious issue about generating income from different sources. I want to just cover a couple of key things, really. How this sort of work, this type of work fits into the broader business rate localisation review, and also just pick up the issue of two-tier splits. So apologies to those that have already gone unitary. Perhaps the Ernst & Young one will encourage one or two of us to follow that route, maybe. So, just on this particular slide, I just wanted to pick a couple of points. Government's already committed to localised business rates by April 2020. We are pushing for April 2019, partly because of the issue around negative RSG in lots of counties and other authorities. There'll still be equalisation needed between authorities. Obviously, there's no levy from the government on the proceeds of growth, so that's shared locally. New responsibilities will be devolved and they'll be fiscally neutral. Now, that's quite a hard message to take, bearing in mind some of the sort of funding shortfalls we've got in the sort of current system. The only one of the ones I want to pick up there is the fact that the CCN and the SCT have got representatives, or are represented on all the business rate steering group and all the individual working groups, including the needs and distribution one. It is complex. If you're looking at issues around not just the needs and distribution, but revaluation, resets, safety nets, the quantum, etc., it is complex, and there's a great degree of uncertainty, particularly around sort of expected growth levels. We heard a little bit about that earlier on today. So it's work in progress. Just wanted to pick up, obviously in the run-up to the end of September, there were two consultation documents that were issued by the DCLG. One was a technical consultation on business rates, and the other one was around the fair funding issues, some of which Chris has touched on so far. And there were, both the CCN and the professional societies, as well as individual authorities, responded to both those documents. The DCLG have told us there's nearly 700 responses to both documents in total. They're still analysing that, so we don't know what the overall comments and feedback are. But these are some of the... no. Yeah, these are some of the key issues on the sort of needs and redistribution one that we put forward in our sort of consultation response. So there needs to be a recognition in that quantum there are unfunded pressures at the moment. And I think we've all made those comments. That authorities without mayors should be given the flexibility to increase business rates, not just the devolved combined authority models. And one of the key ones that Chris has mentioned is, and I think that we've got sort of common cause with all classes of authority, that we need to sort of break that link between regression based on a historical spend for allocation of resources to one that's based on the types of cost drivers that Chris has talked about. Per capita funding, Chris has picked up that. There's a couple of statistics there, whether you look at it sort of by per capita or by household, counties are disadvantaged, and so the system needs to rebalance that to some extent. On the needs and distribution group, the sort of type of work that's gone on at the moment is they are looking at different statistical methodologies based on whether it's outcome-based need, need based on historical trends that I've already mentioned, and also cost drivers. As I've already said, I think there is, certainly in the local government community, a desire to move to cost drivers. But there is tension with particular government departments who like to use the regression based on past analysis, partly because that allows them to influence government policy in terms of how it's implemented locally. There will always be a need for resource allocation, and there will be need for transition because there will be winners and losers in the system. The reason I put the divergence point up here was that obviously local government wants the ability and incentives to grow, not just business rates, but grow our local economies. And there's a question here, both for government and for us locally, about to what extent it's acceptable where there's differential growth rates and differential funding to allow, divergence over time. So there's an issue there and a question mark that's not really been answered. So I'm not going to go through all of these. These are similar to what Chris has talked about, the cost drivers that the needs and distribution group are looking at are similar to what Chris has said, the primary ones there. Most of those are sort of county-based services. And there's a second set of drivers, as well as those primary ones based on client numbers, whether population or where, which are based on deprivation, whether density, either sort of household density or sparsity and accessibility. And we all know in particularly large rural counties like Lincolnshire about the cost of actually taking services to individuals or bringing individuals to services are quite extreme at times. So some of these are some of the potential second-order cost drivers. I now want to move on to the two-tier split, and apologies, as I said, to those that are unitaries already. And I think there's two aspects of this that you need to recognise. We need to recognise that in terms of base funding, the difference between tariff and top-up authorities. Districts, typically within a county area, are tariff authorities. They will usually generate 5 to 10 times the business rates that they actually need to spend in terms of their services, and so there's a tariff taken from them. And the interesting thing here is the tariff and also the top-up, which I'll talk about in a minute, is inflated by the business rate multiplier. So whilst there's an incentive for tariff authorities to grow, there's also an interest by tariff authorities to make sure that their local growth rate is greater than the multiplier increase in the tariff. Otherwise, they're contributing more and more to the tariff. If you think about some of the district councils, if they lose a big employer, it can potentially affect, some of that tariff calculation. The converse thing is counties who are all top-up authorities at the moment, and that's partly because our needs will never be met from local business rates in the short term. So typically we get a top-up. If you actually filter through the top-up that goes into the counties, the actual share of business rate is usually between 70 and 80% by the time the top-up's added, and it sort of goes through the system. So there's issues there. And some of the issues there are around, whether you want to take the if you like, depends on your sort of local growth potential in your area, whether you want to go for incentives around that, or whether you want to look at the risks associated with, potentially some of the areas where your need will outstrip tariff growth, top-up growth. Just in terms of the two-tier split again, so there's the baseline bit which I've talked about where you get top-up. The other aspect is the contentious 80-20 split in terms of business rate growth. 80% in favour of districts at the moment, 20% to counties. One of the issues we're looking at is that, and one of the influences on that split in the future is what it actually goes into the quantum. And there was a lot of mention was made earlier around the strategic place that counties can play in strategic planning, growth, skills, etc. So if we got some of those levers into the quantum, we may want the split to be a little bit sort of fairer or in our favour. So we're modelling different risks and rewards based on different growth rates, looking at different multipliers, and we'll be looking at different needs in terms of adult social care and other service growth. So we're looking at existing 80-20, 70-30, 60-40, 50-50. The reason I'd stop at 50-50 is that once you get into the 50-50 split, you get about 7 or 8 counties that go into the tariff agenda. Now, that may be okay if you're generating loads of growth, but if you're not, there's a huge risk there, particularly in relation to funding things like adult social care. The next one's an interesting one, because we just looked in the SCT at doing a 50-50 split on the existing 50% of business rates that is localised at the moment and assumed a 2% growth rate per year. And I know the commentator said that the average growth rate over the last X number of years have been 2%, but that wasn't the reason he used it. It was just about a reasonable estimate. If that was applied and we switched from 80-20 to 50-50, it actually only, on the basis of the existing business rates, with no addition to the quantum, no redistribution, it actually only shift about 21 million across all counties from districts to counties. So the actual growth is not that significant in the scale of things. Of course, one of the other things that we don't know is the new homes bonus shares. We know that some of that will go into support the future Better Care Fund, but we don't know what the share will be, whether that will shift from the 80-20. Pixel was mentioned in terms of the work that they've already done for the CCN. They will continue to support the CCN with some of the modelling as we go forward. This is another report that came out about 2 weeks ago, and it's worth reading, and it's going to be one of a series of reports that the IFS will do over the next 2 to 3 years. And it does pick up some of the issues that we've exposed today about the differentials of funding and who's really benefited from business rate localisation to date. As mentioned earlier, there were 2 questions that I agree with Simon Edwards who had put up today, but there may be others that comments you want to raise either on the model or generally. One was around, are the priorities and needs we have highlighted appear to be the right one, and what are the most effective strategies and timetables for pressing our case? And I think there's both a short and a long-term game on that one as well. Thank you.